Hey, it's Jake and we're back in my shop with another Holland Built powered by SendCutSend. Today we're going to be tackling the front suspension mounts, so let's get into it. So to start, let's look at the front of the car. Essentially what we have is as these bars come down, I have like a point of contact that I actually am not a fan of anymore. Kind of with all the designs, they kind of change over time. And so when I designed this thing originally, I had more of a rally car idea in mind, but I want to pull this back and have like an approach angle on this that's a little bit more, I think it's a little bit safer. And so what we're going to do is, as I design the suspension, I'm going to end up putting in a bar across here and I'm going to tie it back and pull this whole front nose back. So we're going to have kind of a wedge design here. It's going to be similar to most trophy trucks that you're going to see. Along with that, I'm going to build in a sheet metal mounting system in here that's going to be able to grab onto the front, upper and lower, and also mount my steering rack. So the idea is that I want a similar spacing between my upper and lowers that I did on the rear suspension, which is 8 inches center to center. And then I'm also going to put in my steering rack that's in line with those. So as the suspension travels up and down with my steering straight, we're going to have little to no bump steer. So the next thing is we're gonna go ahead and reverse this entire thing into CAD, and then we're gonna put those mounting points in space based off of my steering rack. So the first thing that I went ahead and did is I reversed that whole front clip that's on the race car based off those measurements that we just took in the shop. So as I look here, I can give you a little 3D view. What we're gonna end up doing is we have these bars that kind of come down here, and I want to know essentially where I can put those suspension points within the center of the car with respect to where the tire and outside suspension is going to lay. Like I said earlier in the video, is I want to have the suspension points on the chassis side to be 9 inches overall. I think I actually said 8 inches earlier, but I went ahead and measured it and it's actually 9. So it's going to be 4.5 inches split off of where the center of the rack is. So this point right here is going to be the center of our rack, our heims that are on our rack. So I have a Shock Therapy XP steering rack here. So this point of contact exactly right here is going to be this point, along with the heims that are going to be on the A-arm. So we have a heim here, is going to be at that upper point. What this is going to do is that if I translate this to be the same spacing and I end up having that kingpin angle put in there, I can, and I put in the right, points of contact here, we can have that kingpin angle come down into the center. That's going to reduce any feedback in the steering. And then if we keep our spacing consistent, what we're going to end up seeing is we're going to have a lot less change in camber as we're rolling through. And so that tire is going to want to travel a little bit better. So we're going to end up having camber into the car. So as I roll into the corners, we're going to end up having the tires straighten up. And then the caster is going to be set when we build the A-arms. So we're not really too concerned about the caster right now. So as I roll this up and we look at this car from a different angle, we're going to see here, I just kind of centered everything in here. But what we're going to have is an offset, like a traditional like trophy truck style suspension, where we're going to have an offset A-arm setup, where the lower A-arm is going to be a little bit more the full width, but the upper A-arm is going to be like half the width, and we're going to have the shock run through like a U-shaped territory on that upper A-arm, and that's going to end up giving our clearance. It's going to make a little bit more sense as this kind of comes into play. So the next thing I'm going to do is go ahead and translate. I want to translate these upper and lower mounts. I want to put ones as far forward as I can get it here and here, and then I want to end up having ones that are about halfway back. And so I'm going to arbitrarily kind of set those, and then we'll get into actually combining everything into one sheet metal design. So let's keep working on this. fast forward a little bit in the process, I'm gonna talk through what I've gotten through now, and so we don't have this long montage. So following off of those upper mounts, I ended up adding another mount. And then the next thing we needed to do is kind of establish where we want that steering rack to be. And so I went ahead and reversed the steering rack. So the most important thing is that we kind of have this like clearance that we need to have on the front end of this, as well as there's 5 holes here. And so I measured center to center on the rack to establish the width that we want to be at. And that's going to determines how far off the center is from the center of the car to the center of these holes here. So when I'm actually driving straight down the road, we're not going to end up having that these be inboard or outboard, because what that'll end up doing is as that wheel's coming up and down, it's going to end up making the tires try to chase that radius and end up resulting in like bump steering, a lot of feedback in the steering. So now that I have that established, you can see here, if we look at it on the front view, we're going to end up having that steering rack is mounted. We can see here that if I end up hiding this one body, we actually end up hiding this body. We have the center of that rack, and I kind of have these roughed in right now, but they're accurate. The center of that rack is going to be in the center of that steering location, as well as these two now are lining up. I went ahead and also removed, or you can actually see the part that we're removing. So this is actually where it currently is. We're going to actually end up pulling this rectangular tube back and end up having that approach angle that we talked about earlier. So it'll end up looking a little bit like this in the end. Also, I ended up creating the initial flange that we're going to end up having in here. What I kind of imagine is that this is going to end up coming in and having a one-piece design that mounts the lower, and then it's going to come back, grab onto my steering rack, and then come back up and grab onto my upper mount. And it's going to be a one-piece design there. Then we'll have a double shear mount. And we're gonna do the same thing with the back mounts of the upper and lower A-arms. We're gonna have this little U or S channel that kind of comes back up. So everything's moving forward. I ended up making these, they're spaced, I believe, it looked like that. Yeah, so 12 inches center to center on my upper A-arm. What that's going to end up doing is it just gives us that little bit of space. I imagine that the shock is going to run here. So this A-arm is going to have to loop around a little bit just to make sure we have clearance of that shock tower and the spring assembly. But we're looking like we're making good progress right now. I'm going to go ahead and move forward. We're going to fast forward into the next step, and then I'll explain that. So fast forward a lot. This took a lot of thinking and going back and forth, but now we're solidifying this design kind of like I talked about. The plans are still the same. I have the front and lower mounts are going to be jogging in like an S or a little joggle forward. What we're looking at is I just want to be consistent and make sure that my lower and upper mounting points are still good. So as we look at this, I guess we can't really see it from this side. Let's flip it around to the front. We can see here, we still have the upper and lower mounts are centered on my original drawing, as well as the steering is still in there. What we ended up doing is I still have that steering rack is kind of tied in here. I have this one jogging up, and then it S is up. I spaced this out, we mirrored it over, and then I also repeated that same entire program kind of up here. So that's gonna S over and up. It looks really good. We added a little text up here. There's some pizzazz on the design. It's always kind of fun to look at that. And then I also added an access hole here. So what we're gonna end up doing is I'm gonna make a mount that ties in sideways and comes up and ties into these through holes right here. We're gonna have a tab and slot design there. And then along with those holes, the bolts are gonna actually come up through the bottom and through that plate. And so what we'll end up doing is that we'll have Allen key access from the bottom, and then we're gonna have nuts on the top. So you'll either be able to put the nut or put a wrench on from this side, or you can wrap back around and see those nuts from the outside. So it gives us some accessibility to where our steering rack is in the design. Lastly, what we're gonna end up doing is we're just gonna kind of gusset everything in. I wanna tie in essentially and web in this entire street from the front all the way to the back, and I want it to come all the way out as close as I can get to the heims, but still have clearance for articulation. Lastly, I want to wrap this design in here to have double shear as well as in here, and then I got to come up with a way to support this upper mount in the back. So this front one I'm going to tie obviously to these front bars. The back mount I need to come up with either some new bars that are coming from like back to the front. What I imagine is I'm going to run bars like laterally or horizontally across the car, and then we're gonna have bars that kind of come down to that upper mount for the rear side of the upper A-arm. So I'm gonna go ahead and get back into it. We're gonna cut back forward one more time. I'm hoping that this one's the final design. This one's taken me a while to kind of figure out. There's a lot of little pieces that we're trying to look at, and then we're gonna go through each individual detail before we go check it out on the car. So after a lot more work, I finally have kind of a finished design here, pending kind of how it looks in cardboard and checking a lot of different templates and stuff in the shop off the CO2 laser. But let's kind of talk through this one a little bit. So before, we ended up having that bar kind of come all the way down far to the forward, come back. We ended up cutting and triangulating this a little bit, has a better approach angle, a little bit better look in my honest opinion. With that being said, we have a steering rack that's fixed, right? So we're kind of working based off of where the steering rack is where those upper and lower A-arm mounts are going to be on the frame. That's just really important for them to all be lined up. So we get rid of that bump steer, like I've said many times. And so I reversed the steering rack to start. And then we obviously have fixed holes that we're trying to match up. So this is gonna be the first thing that I'm gonna check in the shop. I wanna make sure that I have that hole pattern correct before I order these parts in sheet metal. The next thing is that we have a spacing between these upper and lower, or these double shear mounts. That's a fixed measurement. That's based off of spacers that I've purchased along with the Heim that we're gonna be running. We're running 5/8 bolts in the front. and then the spacing is 1/875. So what we're wanting to do is we just want to make sure that there is at least 187 or 1 inch 8/750 in those upper and lower mounts. And that's going to be the same on all 4, or I guess all 8, left and right. Lastly, what we're going to end up doing is we have this gusseted in area. So we're going to add in this new, so this square tubing actually runs all the way to the front right now. What we're going to do is we're going to cut that back. It's going to end up being cut flush with this one mount right here. And we're going to put in a new pipe there. Where these gussets are going to come in is they're going to tie in that whole area. They're also going to tie into a tab and slot design here. So these tabs right here are 1/875 mild steel, and then we're going to end up having all of our gussets made out of 104 thou thick, just for that bridging or that gappage. We're also running that square tubing is flush with the bottom of the chassis. These are also going to be running flush, so we're just going to kind of weld it all in to tie it all in. Lastly, we have some gussets here. I need to fix this little bit area right here still because it got cut on a different operation. But we have some gussets here. These are all going to be 104 thousandths mild steel, whereas all of our brackets are going to be that 187. So when we run from here to here, what is going to be nice is that this is going to be one unit that's going to add a lot of racking stability, as well as kind of just tie in this entire front suspension so that we have good stability in all axes. Lastly, what we kind of talked about last was running in this round tubing from front to rear. I kind of just have it mocked in right now. This is all going to go into place, and then I'm going to weld this in last. So these will be the last things that I do on this front suspension mounting on the chassis. And that's just because it doesn't really matter where they're at. They're mostly there for stability. So it's more important that we have this in the right position first. This bracket right here is just an L bracket. So this L bracket comes around and ties in. We have tab and slot to make sure that it has good connection. And then I have essentially a 104,000 mild steel that's wrapping the top. This will get seam welded all the way down, and then these tubes are going to come in and attach on the top, and that's going to help with that stability also. Lastly, we have this little wing design here in the front. This is going to be just tied into there and dropping on the top. I don't have tabs on this one, mostly because I want it to float a little bit, because I don't really want it to determine where these mounting points are. I want those mounting points to be determined off of where the heims need to be. And that leads me to the last thing that I did, which I'm making a fixturing plate, and this one's just going to be out of some thinner aluminum. I'm putting a little small hole just to tell me which side is up, because it's going to be kind of hard to tell orientation as we do this. But the idea is that this will slide onto the heims. We can put a nut on it, and then those heims can go into each corner. And with the spacers, this ends up determining each individual location. And so if I make 2 of these, one on each side, and I put it all together, we should be able to actually make this entire assembly on my weld table, or at least tack it together, and then drop it in one setup. And that'll save us a little bit of time in figuring and holding and stuff inside the car. That's just the theory anyway. I also think it'd be a really slick way to do this, and I just want to experiment with this theory. So from here, let's go ahead and make some DXFs. I'm going to take you through a really quick tutorial on one of the more intricate ones, just on making a flat pattern. Then we're going to go cut them out in CO2 and get them in cardboard for this one. So before we get too far into the flat pattern, I want to show you a couple tricks. I'm using Fusion 360. Most of the CAD programs have some kind of feature like this. And so when you have a lot of pieces like this, and we've gone through a lot of different iterations, so I have a couple hidden bodies and stuff, it's sometimes really hard and convoluted to figure out where those parts are at. And so if we want a specific part to check, or we want to make a flat pattern to start, it's really hard to figure out where it's at. So the first thing I typically do is I can right click on it, and I can say find in browser. What that's going to do is I have components. I typically try to make everything in components, because then they're individually sourced instead of bodies can be kind of convoluted, and if you make changes it kind of affects the assembly. But we can see this whole body here. Instead of having to go through and deselect all of them, there's an isolate feature on this. And the cool thing about that is that I click that, I isolate it down to just the one fixture, which is really cool. And then if we want to bring everything back, we can come back and unisolate, and we get the whole assembly back. It's a really cool trick that we can go bounce back and forth between each individual component, and we can see, if we want to see this other one, we can bounce back and forth. And so that leads me to my second point, is that when we create a flat pattern, there's kind of two different ways to do it. In Fusion, you can only create one flat pattern per assembly, but you can complete one flat pattern per component. So what I typically try to do is I actually will select these and create a component from the body. What this does is I'll end up, it's always something. Oh, that's right. So we can't do it for sheet metal bodies. So that's a trick that I keep forgetting that I can't do here. But so on this one right here, if I didn't select component the first time I made it, I'm kind of out of luck. So I gotta just do individual flat patterns. So now I can come up here, create flat pattern. I don't typically have a problem with each individual, like I can select any of these faces as my flat face. I'm just gonna pick this one, we're gonna create it. So we're gonna see here, we're gonna pull in this DXF. So the last thing that we wanna do is we're gonna see here, we have our radius ends on each side of our bend center line. So we just wanna make sure that when we finish this, we wanna look at our sheet metal rules, where this part right here is 1875. We want to double check the K factor is correct, our thickness is correct, and our bend condition is correct, our bend radius. Since we're using SendCutSend, we want to go to the material details on each individually material that we're using and make sure that those are correct so that these jogs are going to come out to the right amount of stretch. Since we're trying to locate two different components on both sides, it's really important to have those correct, because that could determine, especially with two bends and a joggle like this, that could throw us off by 1/4 of an inch if we don't have those correct. So if we select that, everything looks good. I already double checked this kind of stuff. We can go back into our flat pattern, activate. And so the cool thing is that we can export a DXF right here. And so Fusion makes it easy. I convert my splines to polylines and click OK. And then we can save our DXF and move forward. If we're doing a normal flat part, a little trick that I kind of typically see, and we're gonna unisolate this part so we can see something. Say this part right here, we're gonna find in browser because we have a lot of parts. And we're gonna isolate this part. So sometimes we end up having a part, I don't know why, sometimes I get these little artifacts that are built into this one. This is like a really good example. And so to make sure that this line doesn't come through on this, most likely is because I wanted this curve, and then I came back in and I re-extruded something to fill back in that area. And then you get these artifacts. This side doesn't have that artifact. So what I typically will do is come in and create a new sketch on this side and say finish. And then if I go to my sketches and I come all the way down, we have a lot of sketches in this design, and I select this one, you can see here that in blue now I have a perfect sketch of that. I'll right click on this and say save as DXF. And what this does is, instead of using the last sketch that you had that has, say, dimensions in it, or like that's what you use to extrude it, sometimes those have little artifacts. So once I have everything extruded and I have a nice clean face, I'll click on that face, create a sketch, and then I save the DXF off of that. It just cleans up your design, make sure everything is where you wanted it to move forward. So let's go ahead, now that we're getting all these DXFs, let's go out in the shop and check this design. So what we're looking at on this is I want to just check my template and make sure that everything lines up. So we're going to flip this over. And then we're just checking hole pattern. I'm also checking to see how well I got that angle kind of reversed. Everything kind of looks like it's going to clear. So I think we're good to go there. So the next step is now we're gonna cut that whole assembly out of cardboard so we can actually glue it together and mock it up for the car. While the other parts are getting cut out on my CO2 laser, I'm gonna double down on my time and start gluing these up as they're coming off to get this final assembly done. Okay, now that we have the whole entire assembly is glued up, we can go ahead and check this in the car. It's really important that we're gonna be looking to see if this thing can fit in the car also while it's all upright to know if I can actually weld this thing up on my bench. So I'm gonna kind of hold it in its orientation. And I think, yeah, we have plenty of clearance even if we're opened up. So I feel really good about welding it all up. We're gonna drop this thing down and look at here. So that looks really good. There's actually one mistake that looks like I've made, which is if we look down here on the end, we can see here that I have too much clearance built in right here. So it's gonna be really important to note that. I wanna make sure that I'm flush with the bottom. That's the most important thing. I don't want anything sticking out below the car to catch on anything. And we wanna be able to weld on this surface here, obviously. So I need to shrink that up. I'm gonna go ahead and take a tape measure to that. Other than that, I think relatively speaking, I'm really happy with how all the mounting points are looking. Looks like we got clearance here. We're gonna end up putting that one bar in below right here, and then we're gonna tie backwards. So we're gonna actually remove this whole bottom chunk. Looks really, really good. So that's the end of this part one. Part two, we're gonna go ahead and take this cardboard design. We're gonna go back into CAD. I'm gonna show you how I put it into SendCutSend's website to get our metal parts, and then we'll get this project finished up. See you on the next one.